Hi, I just wanted to preface this longer video by saying a few things. First of all, I filmed this in the early part of 2024, and I've been editing it little by little throughout the year. And as I started adding B-roll, it kind of took on a life of its own and almost became like a documentary, which wasn't my original intention, but sometimes that's how the creative process works. So you just have to go with it. And so everything I'm talking about might not be current to what's happening right now, but I think that the themes that I discuss, dehumanization, turning a blind eye to suffering, emotionally distancing ourselves from the suffering of others, and the justifications that we come up with in order to be able to do that, these are really timeless themes. And I think that I came down a little hard on people for not speaking out about what was happening in Gaza, and over the past year, I've come to understand that a lot of people have been insulated from the reality of what's been happening in Gaza because the mainstream media deliberately hasn't reported on it as much as they should have been. And they also haven't been providing the historical context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is really critical to understanding what's been happening. And so I've included a list of resources at the end of this video that have been really helpful for me in terms of gaining a deeper understanding of the conflict. I also know that it can be really inconvenient for people to speak out on this issue. And I get that, and I can relate to that. But I think that collectively, we should aspire to be more like Jonathan Glazer, who, it just took a tremendous amount of courage for him to get up on stage at the Oscars and say what he said. And he knew that there were going to be negative consequences, but he put higher principles above self-preservation. And I think that's what people will remember about that night. Looking back, in the years to come, they'll remember that he stayed true to the message and intention behind his film, and that he spoke out against what was happening in Gaza. So with that, I hope you'll give this video a watch and that you find it thought-provoking. Hi, in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 films that were nominated for Academy Awards at the 2024 Academy Awards, and why I think they're relevant to what's happening in the world today, particularly when it comes to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And those 3 films are The Zone of Interest, Killers of the Flower Moon, and Oppenheimer. And I know The Zone of Interest got a lot of attention following the Oscars because the director of the film, Jonathan Glazer, when he got up on stage to receive his award for Best International Feature Film, he made some remarks that were considered controversial. He was basically talking about how his film, which is, I would say that it's about turning a blind eye to the suffering of others, and it does that through examining the domestic life of this commandant at Auschwitz. It's actually based on the real life family of this commandant at Auschwitz who oversaw the death camp where around 1 million Jewish people perished, and how they had this really nice home, like an upper middle class home, and a really nice garden. They seem to have this kind of banal, almost kind of boring life, but a comfortable life. And meanwhile, beyond the walls of their garden, there was this nightmare unfolding where people were arriving in cattle cars, they were being sent to work, they were being sent to the gas chambers and being cremated. They intentionally created the movie with this idea that they wanted the viewer to identify with the perpetrator.
There have been films about perpetrators, and a lot of those examples have shown perpetrators quite villainous, not us. So I wanted to avoid the artifice of cinema. I wanted to look at them more forensically. And the whole idea of this project was to be confronted by a reflection of ourselves on some level.
We have this idea that villains in movies are just these monsters that we can't relate to, but he actually wanted us to relate to them and think about the ways in which we ignore the suffering of others.
All our choices were made to reflect and confront us in the present, not to say, look what they did then, rather look what we do now. Our film shows where dehumanization leads at its worst. It shaped all of our past and present. Right now, we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people. Whether the victims of October the 7th in Israel or the ongoing attack on Gaza, all are victims of this dehumanization. How do we resist?
He was drawing parallels between his film, basically, and what's happening in Gaza. And he said that dehumanization, this film really shows where dehumanization leads to. And dehumanization is a psychological mechanism that we use to emotionally distance ourselves from the suffering of others and putting them outside the bounds of our sense of compassion, our sense of ethics, our sense of morality. If you dehumanize someone, you're saying that they're basically an animal, and we don't really think that our treatment of animals matters morally in our society. The film was really meant to confront people in the present, not to say, like, look at the things that we did back then. Look at how horrible things were back then. And I think that message was lost on a lot of the people who saw the film. They just looked at it as, another movie about the Holocaust, and, when they were watching it, they were probably like, oh, look, the Holocaust was so horrible, these people were so horrible, but they didn't get that the movie was actually meant to be raising a mirror to them, and it was like an invitation for them to reflect on the ways in which they behaved in a similar way. The many ways in which we cling to our own sense of comfort and our desire for status and conformity, and we do that at the expense of morality and ethics. He also said that and I'm going to paraphrase here, he rejected the idea of Jewish identity being lumped in with Zionism and the Holocaust being exploited and appropriated to justify the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, which is the longest military occupation in modern history, which was preceded by a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing where hundreds of thousands of people were expelled from their homes. He also said that it was this occupation that gave rise to October 7th and the atrocities that occurred then, and now what's happening in Gaza. So it's really the occupation which is responsible. He was very nervous, understandably, because he knew that he was going to receive a lot of backlash, which he did, but he did the right thing because they were very intentional about what the message of their movie was supposed to be. And the moment that message became inconvenient, he couldn't just throw it out the window, right? He had to be true to it. I think he knew that he wouldn't be able to really live with himself if he didn't speak up about what was happening in Gaza. And the whole Oscars ceremony was very interesting to watch, and I think very revealing. It started 5 minutes late, and that was because there were protesters that were blocking traffic and people protesting what was happening in Gaza, calling for a permanent ceasefire. And it seemed to me like a handful of people wearing red pins, and the red pins were representing this movement, which is Artists for a Ceasefire. But really not that many people were wearing them. There were a few people wearing pins that had the Palestinian flag on it. But other than that, it seemed like people weren't expressing solidarity with the people of Gaza, which I thought was unfortunate. And I think if it wasn't for Jonathan Glazer's speech and for Cillian Murphy, who is the star of Oppenheimer, his speech where he talked about being Irish.
And I'm a very proud Irish man standing here tonight, so... we made a film about the man who created the atomic bomb, and for better or for worse, we're all living in Oppenheimer's world, so I would really like to dedicate this to the peacemakers everywhere.
Aside from those two speeches and the fact that it started 5 minutes late and some people were wearing these pins, I don't think he would have known that on the other side of the world you have a trapped population, half of which are children, who have nowhere to go. They've been relentlessly bombed, and the area that they've been living in is now basically flattened. They don't have access to food, water, electricity. They've lost loved ones. People have lost limbs. Many people are suffering from infectious diseases and not having access to medication. People have had amputations performed on them without anesthesia. Children have had amputations performed on them without anesthesia. God knows how many people have died long deaths trapped under the rubble, which I think is one of the worst ways to die. The U.S. is very much involved. The bombs that have been dropped on Gaza are U.S.-made bombs. So I think that Americans have a responsibility to speak out, and the fact that people weren't speaking out and they were just dressed to the nines and like laughing, acting as if nothing is happening while this apocalyptic nightmare is unfolding, it really represented to me what this film was really about. And it's almost like the universe is like revealing something to us. And actually, one of the reasons why I love film so much is that I think it's one of the ways that we give expression to a lot of the things that are kind of percolating in the collective unconscious, the things that we don't really know what to do with. And I think film is like one of the ways that we kind of process and try to make sense of and come to terms with these things. I thought that the zone of interest was very relevant, obviously, to what's happening in Gaza, but then I also thought Killers of the Flower Moon was relevant because Israel really represents the last dregs of this settler colonial paradigm, and the US, which has been, providing the bombs that are being used to bomb Gaza, is a settler colonial country who hasn't come to terms with our settler colonial past. And I think that this film kind of confronts us with what actually happened to the native indigenous people who were living in the Americas, and in this case, the United States. And it doesn't deal with, the displacement and the massacres. It kind of deals with the aftermath and the lingering racism and marginalization of the native indigenous people. But I think there really haven't been that many films that kind of accurately represent what happened to the Native Americans. And so I thought it was a really important film. And I think it's also relevant because one of the themes is oil and the stealing of the money that came from the oil that they discovered on their land. And I think that's also happening in Palestine, the theft of resources. I think a lot of people aren't aware that there's actually gas off the coast of Gaza. And the US and Israel announced in the summer of 2023 that they were going to start drilling for that gas. And ostensibly, they were going to use the money from that to revitalize the Palestinian economy. And, maybe that's true. Maybe they genuinely did want to give them the money from that. But I think now that Gaza is being flattened and there are calls to annex it, we have to keep an eye on what becomes of that gas. I also thought that Oppenheimer was relevant because it's about Oppenheimer, who oversaw the creation of the atomic bomb, the first atomic bomb, and ushered us into this new era, the atomic age, where we now have the ability to destroy civilization and bring many species down with us. And to me, the message that I took away from it is that our wisdom and our humanity hasn't kept pace with our ability to innovate and have these technological breakthroughs. So I thought that it was a missed opportunity for the producers of Oppenheimer and the director, Christopher Nolan, when they received the prize for Best Director and Best Feature Film, that they didn't talk about that. They didn't talk about the meaning of the film and what the film represents in terms of where humanity is potentially heading if we don't cultivate more wisdom and we don't cultivate compassion and figure out a way to solve problems diplomatically instead of resorting to war. The zone of interest is about the family of this commandant at Auschwitz. It's based on the true story of this family that lived in the zone of interest, which is the area that surrounded Auschwitz, and their domestic life, going about day-to-day activities, and they have a pretty cushy, comfortable life. The wife of this commandant, Hedwig, she in particular really seems to embrace it. And it seems like she's kind of a social climber. She feels like this is the best that she's ever going to be able to do in terms of achieving social status and having a comfortable lifestyle. She's aware of what's happening beyond the walls of their garden. So while they're going about their lives, you hear people shouting, you hear gunshots, you see smoke rising from the crematorium, and they just tune it out. They pretend, for the most part, like it's not happening. And by the way, I think this title, Zone of Interest, is a really great title because not only are they referencing this area that they lived in, but I think it also kind of encapsulates this idea of what do we pay attention to and what do we choose not to pay attention to? What do we shut out of our awareness? The entire time that I was watching the movie, I was thinking about Gaza and how so many people have decided to ignore the suffering of the people in Gaza. And in the US, while Israel has been relentlessly bombing Gaza, Americans have been sleeping warm in their beds at night, just going about their lives, posting on Instagram, going to restaurants. We saw this at the Oscars where people were just celebrating movies like, nothing was happening. And then a month earlier, we had the Super Bowl where people were totally preoccupied with Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. Meanwhile, Israel was bombing Gaza. And I think the parallels are really stark when you think about Israel, which is right next to Gaza. And it used to be that before October 7th, you could look into Gaza from Israel and you could see the barbed wire, you could see the watchtowers. And there was actually a hill where people used to gather during different bombing campaigns, like Operation Protective Edge and Operation Cast Lead, where people would gather on this hill, they would picnic, and they would watch the IDF bomb Gaza. Israelis have been going about living their lives and living lives of comfort and abundance, while people in Gaza have been starving and haven't had access to water and electricity and have been dying, slow deaths under the rubble, having surgeries performed on them without anesthesia. Children are being orphaned. Parents are losing their children.
In my frustration last night, after seeing the 100th child blown to bits in Palestine, I decided to check out the location tag of Tel Aviv on Instagram just to see what the people of Israel were dealing with, and the results were quite telling. As you can see, they're hanging out, they're taking selfies, they're ordering sushi. This is a photo from the beach. They're having little performances in boutique hotels. I was genuinely shocked by what I saw, and you can go look too. Go look at Tel Aviv's location right now and watch all the stories of people. It's really, really shocking to see it in comparison with what is coming out on the ground from Gaza, 40 miles away. And, people have you thinking that this is a war between two equal parties, but this is colonialism. You're looking at it right now. Everyone seems to be having a great time while there's a genocide happening 40 miles away from them.
It's not just that they're turning a blind eye to the suffering of Gazans, but they're actually cheering it on in many cases. And they think that it's a really good thing.
Yeah. Also, as long as they're in their Nakba state in their tents, and we're living still, if you put aside the news, day to day is okay. Yesterday we went to a concert in Elkon Park. We had lots of fun, me and my girlfriend, Shalom Chanoch. We danced, and it was amazing. And you can't help but think it's nice to know that you're dancing in a concert while hundreds of thousands of Gazans are,
homeless,
like sitting in a tent and eating.
Makes it even better.
Yeah,
more enjoyable concert. If only they put the live video footage of Gaza. But seriously, you guys that's what people don't understand. Look, I know that you guys might be appalled by this, some of the listeners, but seriously, this is how Israelis feel. And you might think that Eitan Weinstein and Naor, who refuses to kind of back me up on it publicly.
I'm from the UN.
Yeah, he's the UN. But you might think I'm extreme. But I have conversations with lots of people, coworkers, friends. People enjoy knowing that they are suffering.
They've also been blocking aid coming into Gaza. Israeli protesters have gathered at border crossings to prevent aid trucks going into Gaza. So, on the other side of the wall, you have starving and dehydrated Gazans who desperately need aid, and they're trying to prevent them from getting any sort of relief.
On the trailer of this truck is wheat flour for the starving and besieged people of the Gaza Strip. But this humanitarian aid and thousands more aid shipments are not making it to the Palestinians in Gaza because Israelis have decided to engage in a direct action blockade. As soon as the settlers show up at these crossings, the military, meant to secure the area, stands down and guides everyone to the border gates. Then, the Israeli military uses the presence of civilians, which they invited and escorted, to justify the closing of the humanitarian aid crossing gate for hours and sometimes entire days. The settlers bring cotton candy mix, machine guns, pastries, their babies, prayer books, and loudspeakers.
We give pastries for the people, for the soldiers, for the cops, for everybody. This one we give to our people. This is really humanitarian, okay? They need to block the aid to Gaza. They need to block the gas to Gaza. Everything to block.
On top of that, they've been making fun of Palestinians, mocking their suffering, seemingly deriving a sense of joy and satisfaction from the idea of Gaza being leveled and people just living in utter destitution. I don't think that Israelis are fundamentally bad people, but I do think that their culture and their education system really encourages them to have a contemptuous view towards Palestinians.
Like anyone growing up in Israel, I went through the whole indoctrination mechanism. And we're being trained to be soldiers from kindergarten, literally from kindergarten. The moment I realized I managed to sort of overcome that indoctrination, then everything became very clear because the situation is crystal clear. One of the main successes of Israeli propaganda is to convince the world that the situation is complicated. But it's far from being complicated. It's probably the least complicated conflict in the world today. And it's all about basically those who have the power, those who oppress and subjugate and trade over the indigenous people of the land who have been oppressed and subjugated and expelled from their land. And this is what it's about. The situation here is not very different other than the way it is perceived in the world and among Israeli society themselves. They like to perceive themselves as being something else, as being, liberal and progressive and all of that. And I also thought of myself as such until I realized that actually, this is not the case. The case is very clear, and I'm not on the right side of history. And that's when, with what I managed to overcome this type of brainwashing, then the rest was very easy.
How do you take nice Jewish boys and girls and turn them into monstrous killers of children when they reach 18? It takes a very long, thorough, and sophisticated education to do that. And that was my question, How do you do that? We have an organization called Breaking the Silence, where soldiers confess what they did in the West Bank. And many of these confessions, the soldiers say, I was educated to believe that whatever I do to the Palestinians will save us from another Holocaust. And only when I aimed my rifle at a little girl, I realized that I was the evil one. And then I stopped. So this education is so entrenched, and the dehumanization of Palestinians especially is so strong that it's very hard for people, especially young people, to get rid of that and to see these people as human beings at all ages. And I think Israeli education, unfortunately, is very successful.
And here I get to the third set of values which enable us Israelis to live in peace with the occupation. And this is maybe the most crucial one and the worst one. We say victimization, we say it's chosen people. When I say victimization, it goes without saying we have to mention the Holocaust and the unforgettable Mrs. Golda Meir that the American jury had exported to Israel. She said once, this unforgettable woman, that after the Holocaust, the Jews have the right to do whatever they want. But the third set of values is the most dangerous one, and this is the systematic dehumanization of the Palestinians, which enable us Israelis to live in peace with everything, because if they are not human beings like us, then there is not really a question of human rights. And if you scratch under the skin of almost every Israeli, you will find it there. Almost no one will treat the Palestinians as equal human beings like us. I once wrote that we treat the Palestinians like animals, and I got so many protest letters from animal rights organizations, rightly so.
So I think the fact that they've conflated Palestinians with the Nazis is one of the reasons why they hate Palestinians so much. And another reason is dehumanization. They're taught that Palestinians are basically primitive and backwards. There's this idea that the Israelis are more, quote unquote, civilized than the Palestinians, and therefore they have the moral high ground. And the Palestinians aren't human, they're less than human. They're animals. And when South Africa charged Israel of committing genocide against the Palestinian people at the ICJ, in their filing, there was this whole section of genocidal remarks that Israeli officials had made, saying things like, we're, quote unquote, dealing with human animals.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
This is typical genocidal rhetoric because there are so many examples in human history of when people, especially in positions of power who've had the ability to inflict large-scale acts of violence against another group of people have called another group of people animals, and then they've gone on to commit horrible acts of violence against them. So when someone who's a government official calls another group of people animals, that's a very ominous sign and a very foreboding sign. Animals fall outside the bounds of our sense of compassion, our sense of ethics and morality. We have this idea that we can do whatever we want to them. We don't have to think about the moral and ethical implications because we have this idea that human beings matter morally, but animals don't. Human beings matter morally, but fuck the animals. And that's why dehumanization is very destructive. But we also have to understand where dehumanization stems from. And that brings me to the topic of animals, which I think was the other elephant in the room when it came to this film. I think people really have no idea the scale of suffering that they are complicit in. 3 times a day, we take into our bodies the flesh and secretions of animals who either died a violent death or are being exploited and are in confinement and will be killed when they're no longer considered profitable. We take that into our bodies, and 3 times a day we shut down our sense of compassion, our sense of empathy. We turn a blind eye to their suffering. We kill 23 million animals per day in the US, land animals, and more animals are killed per week than all human beings that have been killed in all conflicts since the beginning of human history. We kill 70 billion land animals per year worldwide and trillions of fish. So, that's an immense amount of suffering, and people choose to tune it out because they have, emotional attachments to eating the foods that they're accustomed to enjoying. I remember when I was in college and I was starting to learn more about what we were doing to the animals, I had this weird feeling that our world was not what I had thought it was, and that underneath this civilized veneer, there was this whole ocean of suffering that we were kind of aware of, like in the back of our mind, but we knew enough about it that we knew that we didn't want to know more. This idea was so horrifying to me that I just decided to suppress it, and I was like, I don't want to live in that kind of world. So I kind of just pushed it down. I pushed it out of my awareness. But I did start to learn more. I continued learning more about what we were doing to the animals. And then I did go vegan a few years later. And then I saw this movie, Earthlings, which I think was really my red pill moment when I really got the enormity of what we were doing to the animals.
On the heath, King Lear asked Gloucester, "How do you see the world?" And Gloucester, who is blind, answered, "I see it feelingly. I see it feelingly." 3 primary life forces exist on this planet: nature, animals, and humankind. We enter as lords of the earth, bearing strange powers of terror and mercy alike. The human beings should love animals as the knowing love the innocent, and the strong love the vulnerable. It seems the fate of many animals is either to be unwanted by man, or wanted too much. Isn't it enough that animals the world over live in permanent retreat from human progress and expansion? And for many species, there is simply nowhere else to go.
It's a brutal film to watch, but I really think everyone should watch it, and it examines the ways in which we exploit and kill animals for food, clothing, entertainment, experimentation. I think those are the main ones, and it's just so harrowing to watch, but I think we really need to acknowledge this because I think it's our biggest cultural blind spot. It's a thing that we don't want to look at. We have this consensus that we don't go there, we don't talk about it, it's a taboo thing to talk about. But meanwhile, it's creating a lot of dysfunction in our society. I think that, if we want to live in a healthy society, then we have to acknowledge these more shadowy aspects of our culture, and that includes taking a look at what's happening to animals and the ways in which we tune out their suffering. And we say that they don't matter because they're different from us. Those of us who've had dogs and cats, we know that they suffer, we know that they can feel pain, and so there's no reason why we shouldn't have compassion for them and what they're going through. And it's interesting because the producer of The Zone of Interest, James Wilson, when he was giving his acceptance speech at the BAFTA Film Awards, he said that the film reminded a friend of his about the walls that we construct in our lives, that we choose not to look behind.
A friend wrote me after seeing the film the other day that he couldn't stop thinking about the walls we construct in our lives, which we choose not to look behind. Those walls aren't new from before or during or since the Holocaust, and it seems stark right now that we should care about innocent people being killed in Gaza or Yemen in the same way we think about innocent people being killed in Mariupol or in Israel.
In the film, The Zone of Interest, there's this wall separating the garden and their domestic life from the horrors that are unfolding in Auschwitz. I thought that was interesting because I think that the Haas home is really a metaphor for this concept of the shadow, which is something that the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung came up with. So the shadow is basically this part of our consciousness that we don't want to look at because we're afraid of what we might find there. So all the things that don't fit with the image that we would like to have of ourselves and of the world, we kind of push out of our conscious awareness and it goes down into the shadow, but it's still there. And so I think the Haas home is really a perfect metaphor for this idea of the shadow, because on the surface you have the conscious awareness of people and how they represent themselves to the world. And so the Haas family is presenting themselves as normal, decent people who are just like you and me. But then on the other side of this wall is all of the atrocities that they're complicit in and that they're actually facilitating. This film, the more I think about it, the more brilliant I realize it is. The filmmakers were really kind of holding up a mirror to all of us and inviting us to think about and contemplate the ways in which we don't live in alignment with our values and our sense of ethics. The next film I'm going to talk about is Killers of the Flower Moon by Martin Scorsese. It's based on the true story of these Native Americans, the Osage tribe, who were unique amongst other Native American tribes in that they bought their own reservation. So they had the rights to everything in that land. And it turned out that there was a shitload of oil on it, and they wound up becoming very wealthy. It takes place in the 1920s. It's about these white people in the area who insinuate themselves into their lives and try to siphon off money from them. I thought it was a very important film because, first of all, like, this is a totally forgotten piece of American history that most people don't know about, and it's fascinating. But also because I just don't think that there are that many films that really accurately depict what happened to the Native Americans. I think a lot of people living in the US have this kind of blind patriotism and don't really acknowledge what happened in order for European settlers to be here. I know when I was growing up, we celebrated Columbus Day. And Columbus is someone who enslaved thousands of people. He killed thousands of people. He didn't discover anything because people were living in the Americas, but he's been celebrated as a sort of hero. Now, some states are starting to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, which I think is a step in the right direction. But a lot of other states still celebrate Columbus Day. When I was growing up, I remember my brother playing with cowboys and Indians. And now in retrospect, I think I can look back and see that that was wrong because, first of all, like a 5-year-old boy should not be associating violence with play and having fun. But also because, of course, he was supposed to identify with the cowboys because he was white, and the cowboys were, quote unquote, more civilized. The Native Americans were savages, and they were primitive, and they weren't educated. So I think, this game Cowboys and Indians really perpetuated this bigotry and racism that I think we're starting to kind of move away from, but was really entrenched in American culture. And in fact, a lot of Western films, they had a lot of racist portrayals of Native Americans, and the white people were portrayed as, quote unquote, more civilized, and therefore they were the good, decent people, and the Native Americans were barbaric and they were savage, and so therefore they were the villains. I also think it's a very significant film because of what's happening in Israel and Palestine. Israel really represents the last dregs of this settler colonial paradigm, which was so dominant for like the past 5 centuries or so. The U.S. really, like as a settler colonial country, and we're the country that's providing the bombs that are being used to bomb Gaza, we haven't really come to terms with our settler colonial past. I think there just hasn't been enough deep acknowledgement and enough of a reckoning of what really went down. That brings me to this idea of civilization versus barbarism. And Netanyahu said that this war was also the U.S.'s war, which it is, because the U.S. is providing the money and the bombs and the diplomatic cover that's allowing it to continue. But he's saying that it was also the U.S.'s war because it was a battle between civilization and barbarism.
And it's not only our war, it's your war too. It's the battle of civilization against barbarism. This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization.
And we are not fighting just our war, we're fighting the war of all civilized countries and all civilized peoples.
This is a battle for the future of civilization. Because this kind of barbarism that many believed was a relic of the past has come full force in the 21st century.
He was echoing something that the founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, said: "We shall be a sector of the wall of Europe against Asia. We shall serve as an outpost of civilization against barbarism." And when he said that, he was echoing the mentality of a lot of Europeans when they came to the Americas, which was that they were, quote unquote, bringing civilization with them, and therefore they had the moral high ground because the native indigenous population were uncivilized, they were primitive, they were savages, and therefore they could do whatever they wanted to them, and they didn't have to think about it from a moral and ethical perspective. And I think the irony is that they were the ones who were barbaric in their treatment of Native Americans, and they were the ones who were uncivilized. To me, like, being civilized is treating other people with respect and dignity.
We've proven that we were civilized 7,000 years ago. Are we so underdeveloped? That's not civilization. Civilization is how do you contact the other people? Do you know how to love? Do you know how to care? This is civilization. If you go to a very poor man here and he has nothing to give you, he'll go and borrow from his neighbors a loaf of bread and he'll offer it to you. In Europe, you may faint and drop dead in the street and people will just walk away from you.
And I think a lot of Israelis kind of cling to this idea that they're more civilized and that they, quote unquote, brought civilization with them and they made the desert bloom.
We, as a Jewish people, bring flourishing to a place while the Palestinians just bring shit culture and destruction. It's like, no one talks about the fact that everything is about comparing us, right? And saying, oh, well, what would we do in this situation? What would they do in this situation? And trying to, it's like, no, we're better. We're just better. We're better. Like, I don't know how else to put it.
Sorry, not sorry.
Sorry, not sorry. We're better. We have a better culture. We're a better society. And yes, it would be a great thing if we took over all the West Bank and they weren't there.
If you mean whose side should one be on, Israel or the Arabs, I would certainly say Israel because it's the advanced, technological, civilized country amidst a group of almost totally primitive savages who have not changed for years and who are racist and who resent Israel because it's bringing industry and intelligence and modern technology into their stagnation.
When in reality, the Palestinians were cultivating crops before they got there. And they weren't primitive, actually. You know, they had colleges, they had arts, they had cinemas, they had bustling ports and bustling marketplaces. And they're definitely not primitive now. They're very literate. Many of them go on to become professors and doctors and engineers. And I think that's a threat to a lot of Israelis' sense of superiority, which is why I think they've really been targeting hospitals and universities and cultural centers.
לכל מי ששאל למה אין לימודים בעזה, אופס, נפל לנו טיל עליכם, איזה בסיוך. אבל ככה לא תהיו מהנדסים יותר.
As you can also see, the whole department, all the Shifa hospital is completely destructed. Anybody that has wounds, anybody that is sick, anybody that needs any medications, they're not allowed to come to the hospital. As you can see, there is no treatment at all.
I want to speak on behalf of all the medical students in Gaza, Islamic and Al-Azhar University. Literally, we have no future. We have completely destroyed it. This is a Shifa hospital. It was one of the biggest hospitals in Palestine. Here we did our internships and our theoretical classes. We have destroyed our dreams and our source of knowledge.
They need to establish themselves as being superior to the Palestinians. Otherwise, what they're doing to the Palestinians creates too much cognitive dissonance. But even if the Palestinians didn't have these trappings of quote-unquote civilization, it still wouldn't have been right to steal their land from them, to dominate them, to oppress them, just as it wasn't right what the Europeans did to the Native Americans. Just because they were living closer to nature didn't make them innately inferior to the Europeans. And I think we're starting to recognize that we can actually learn a lot from Native indigenous cultures that live close to the land and live in harmony with nature, because we need nature. Nature is healing. We come from nature, and if we want to survive on this planet, we need to harmonize with nature. And I think another parallel between this film, Killers of the Flower Moon, and what's happening in Palestine is this idea of the theft of resources. Killers of the Flower Moon is about oil to a certain extent, and taking the money from these Native indigenous people that they were able to get from the oil. And you also have a theft of resources happening in Palestine, in the West Bank. And I think possibly in Gaza as well, because there's actually gas off the coast of Gaza, which I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And the US and Israel announced in the summer of 2023 that they were going to start drilling for gas. Ostensibly, they were going to use this money to revitalize the Palestinian economy. But now that Gaza is flattened and it's uninhabitable, and it looks like it's potentially going to be annexed, I think we have to, keep an eye on what becomes of that. So I hope that there are more movies like this that depict what Native Americans went through and the destructiveness of white supremacy, this ideology that enabled colonizers to treat Native Americans in a way that was so brutal and so savage and so evil. And I also hope that there are more movies that show the Palestinian experience and what they've gone through. The final film I'll talk about is Oppenheimer, which is about the career of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who oversaw the Los Alamos division of the Manhattan Project, which brought the first atomic bomb into existence. And after they created the atomic bomb and tested it, shortly thereafter, it was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And I think Oppenheimer was someone who was just so brilliant. And he was just totally caught up in the innovation and the technology and the breakthroughs that they were having and kind of pushing the limits of what human beings were capable of, that he didn't fully grasp the implications of what it would mean when this atomic bomb was unleashed, and what it would mean for the people on the ground who were experiencing it, and also what it meant for humanity now that he was going to be ushering us into this new era, the atomic age, where we now have the ability to destroy ourselves. And I think in the film, the Japanese people are kind of seen as this abstraction. The people who are working on the atomic bomb are just so disconnected from what's going to happen to the Japanese people. So I think a really good movie that would complement Oppenheimer, if you want to have like a better idea of like what it was actually like to live through the atomic bomb, is a movie called White Light, Black Rain. And it's a documentary that interviews people who survived the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they were very young. And they talk about the things that they saw. Like, they saw people with their eyeballs coming out of their sockets. They saw people flying across the room, people with skin hanging off of them, and they themselves experienced horrible burns and disfigurement. Many of them lost, their families, in some cases, like their entire family. So basically, like, ruined their lives. And I think that if we're okay with this idea of taxpayer money being sent overseas to bomb other countries, we should be willing to see the effects of that and to bear witness to what those people are going through, and be willing to look at the footage of children being pulled out of the rubble, in the case of Gaza, because otherwise we ourselves aren't going to fully grasp the implications of what these wars actually mean. And I think a lot of people are ambivalent about what happened in terms of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think a lot of people feel that it was necessary to bring an end to the war because the Japanese wouldn't have surrendered otherwise. But I think a lot of people aren't aware that 6 out of 7 5-star generals and admirals were actually against the use of the atomic bomb.
General Dwight Eisenhower, later president, said Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and he wasn't alone in his opposition to that. In fact, a post-war panel of 1,000 experts, including surviving Japanese leaders, concluded Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped.
My intuitive sense is that it was really more about showing the world what the US had created, what we were capable of, and kind of showing everyone who was boss. By the way, in the lead up to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese were constantly depicted in a dehumanizing way in the Western press and in cartoons. So I think there was kind of this racist perspective towards Japanese people that enabled Americans to kind of emotionally distance themselves from what was about to happen to them. And what I took from this film was that our wisdom has not kept pace with our ability to have these technological breakthroughs and innovations, and we're now at the point where we have the ability to destroy ourselves. And I think that we need to cultivate wisdom. We need to cultivate compassion for each other. We need to stop otherizing one another, because the reality is that we're all connected, and what we do to each other, we do to ourselves. So with that, I'll kind of wrap up this video. I encourage people to see these films, because I think that watching films like these, which examine the more shadowy aspects of humanity, can help us learn more about ourselves and kind of the path that we're on and what we need to do to course correct. And I'll conclude by reading an ancient Sanskrit mantra. May all beings everywhere be happy and free, and may the thoughts, words, and actions of my own life contribute in some way to that happiness and to that freedom for all.